Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook with Karen Aram. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, May 7th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. While we Americans are preoccupied with posturing presidential politics, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel, that is by far the most feared government in the world. And that's not surprising. Our government is today making war in 8 countries, and U.S. war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Although most Americans are not aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, that is, killing people, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. We're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing U.S. drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. Drone assassinations are directed by the President of the United States. Bush, Obama, and Trump have all been involved with it. More than 250,000 American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. The 70,000 U.S. troops in the Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, torture, and murder. The U.S. is torturing the people of Venezuela, the country with the world's largest reserve of oil, in order to overthrow their government, which isn't following orders from Washington. Since 1945, the United States has killed more than 20 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II for the American 1%. It is shamefully the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon the President and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income for Americans who have been made poor by generations of our government's war. Our group, the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort, is on Facebook at Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Moscow, that is the Russian news services, is being very careful on what to leak from yesterday's meeting between Foreign Minister Lavrov and the United States Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Between Lavrov and Pompeo, there was a discussion which did not apparently include the Russiagate nonsense, that is, the notion that Russia meddled in the U.S. election, that so exercises our domestic politics. They were talking instead about the relationship between, the military relationship between the two countries, from what we can glean from what's been reported primarily by Russia. Lavrov must have been quite brunt on both Iran and Venezuela. He knows that Pompeo is just a minor evangelist gangster who has stepped up to speak for the American government. He knows the Pentagon has gamed military scenarios across the board. That is, the Pentagon spending a lot of the money we give them to work out what would happen in the event of military confrontations between the U.S. and Russia. The results, as you can imagine, are appalling. But he does know that the psycho national security advisor, John Bolton, wants war at all costs. But he also knows that Trump is focused only on winning the presidential election in 2020, and for that reason cannot risk another quagmire on the scale of Vietnam or even Iraq. It's quite telling that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, is stressing that the meeting built on the 90-minute Trump-Putin phone call from last week. That's what they're talking about. Meanwhile, we have to be concerned here whether National Security Advisor Bolton, he's the one with the walrus mustache, is steering Trump into war with Iran. Last week, it was Venezuela in America's gun sights. And while that was going on, Secretary of State Pompeo thundered, quote, "While a peaceful solution is desirable, military action is possible. If that's what is required, that's what the United States will do." Bolton tutored Vladimir Putin on the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. Quote, this is Bolton's account of what the Monroe Doctrine, a unilateral statement of 18th century Americans. This is our hemisphere. It's not where the Russians ought to be interfering. That's what Bolton said, eh? After Venezuela's army decided not to rise up and overthrow the elected president, Nicolas Maduro, it was Iran that attracted the attention of America's war makers. Bolton ordered the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, its battle group, that is the ships that accompany it and so forth, and a bomber force to the Mideast, quote, to send a clear and unmistakable message to the Iranian regime that any attack on United States interests or those of our allies will be met with unrelenting force, close quote. Bolton very much wants to use unrelenting force. But what attack was Bolton talking about? Apparently, Israel had alerted Bolton that an Iranian strike on U.S. interests in Iraq was imminent. Flying to Finland, where he met with Secretary Lavrov, Pompeo echoed Bolton's warning. Quote, "We've seen escalatory actions from the Iranians," interesting phrase, "and we will hold the Iranians accountable for attacks on American interests. If these actions take place, if they do by some third-party proxy, whether that's a Shia militia group or the Houthis or Hezbollah, we will hold the Iranian leadership directly accountable for that," close quote. That's what the American Secretary of State is saying. Taken together, the Bolton-Pompeo threats add up to an ultimatum that any attack by Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, or Iran-backed militias on Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, or the Gulf states will bring a U.S. retaliatory response on Iran itself. They really want war with Iran. You remember back at the time of the attack on Iraq, the neoconservative line was, real men go to Iran. And so this is nothing new. Did President Trump approve of this saber-rattling? For he appears to be going along. He's pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions. Last week, he canceled waivers he'd given 8 nations to let them continue buying Iranian oil. You may wonder why the United States is in the business of telling other countries whom they can buy from and whom they can't, but that is the case. The purpose of the sanctions from the United States on our supposed allies about buying Iranian oil is to reduce Iran's oil exports, 40% of their GDP, to zero, to deepen an economic crisis that's already expected to cut Iran's GDP this year by 6%. Trump has also designated Iran a terrorist state and the Republican Guard a terrorist organization. The first time we've done that with the armed forces of a foreign nation. We don't even do that with North Korea. Iran responded last Tuesday by naming the U.S. as a state sponsor of terror and designating U.S. forces in the Middle East as terrorists. Iran has also warned that if we choke off its oil exports that exit the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz, the strait could be closed to other nations. As 30% of the world's oil shipments transit the strait, closing it would cause a global economic crash. In 1973, when President Nixon rescued Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC Arabs imposed an oil embargo. Gas prices spiked so high that Nixon considered taking a train to Florida for his Christmas vacation. It affected even the highest reaches of the American government. The gas price surge, more importantly, the gas price surge so damaged Nixon's standing with the public that it became a contributing factor in the drive for his impeachment. Today, Trump's approval rating in the Gallup poll has reached an all-time high, 46%, a level surely related to the astonishing performance of the U.S. economy following Trump's tax cuts and sweeping deregulation. There's a long argument about whether those tax cuts and that deregulation really produce that economic efflorescence that we seem to be enjoying, or at least some people in America are enjoying. But the numbers are there, and the results are satisfactory to the government and to the president. While a Gulf war with Iran might be popular at the outset, we always what would it do for the U.S. economy or our ability to exit the forever war in the Middle East, as Trump has pledged to do? In late April, in an interview with Fox News, Iran's foreign minister identified those who he believes truly want a U.S.-Iranian war. Asked if Trump were seeking the confrontation and the regime change that Bolton championed, that is in Iran, before becoming his national security advisor, Mohammad Javad Zarif said, "No, I do not believe President Trump wants to do that. I believe President Trump ran on a campaign promise of not bringing the United States into another war. President Trump himself has said that the U.S. spent $7 trillion in our region." This is the Iranian foreign minister describing how he understands, perhaps it could be better than some Americans, what Trump is doing. President Trump himself said that the U.S. spent $7 trillion in our region, said Foreign Minister Zarif. And the only outcome of that was that we have more terror, we have more insecurity, and we have more instability. People in our region are making the determination that the presence of the United States is inherently destabilizing. I think President Trump agrees with that, close quote. Now, this is the view, as I say, of the Iranian leadership. But if it's not Trump pushing for confrontation and war with Iran, who is? Said Zarif, quote, "I believe the B team wants to actually push the United States, lure President Trump into a confrontation that he doesn't want," close quote. And who makes up the B team? Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran identifies them: Bolton, Benjamin Netanyahu, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. Should the B team succeed in its ambition, it will be Trump's war, and Trump's presidency will pay the price. And that's the reason we're seeing such remarkable hesitancy to push forward the war in the Middle East, including, most notably, the hour-and-a-half phone call last week between Trump and Putin that reignited the Russiagate enthusiasms of the fantasists of the American news media. The situation in regard to Iran is serious in spite of these contradictions within the American leadership. The neoconservatives want war with Iran, as they have since the beginning of the century, and it's not at all clear that they won't get it. It's very dangerous, but of course we know very little about it in this country because it's hidden in the fantasized news reports we get through mainstream media. So, dangerous enough in the Middle East. Let's turn to the Western Hemisphere. And Karen Aram wants to talk about what the U.S. is doing in regard to Venezuela.
Actually, Carl, I came in today to talk about Venezuela, primarily the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. But now I have to speculate and make a couple comments on Iran before I forget what I was going to say based upon your statement. Yes, it's very dangerous what is happening, what we're doing to Iran. And I'm going to speculate that while Trump, looking at 2020, as a candidate who says he doesn't want any more war, I think most candidates are going to give that impression that they don't want any war, because it is very unpopular with the American people today, unless, of course, we use mercenaries or proxies, and then we don't have to look at it. And we don't seem to notice how much of our taxpayers' funding goes in to support the military, regardless of who's actually doing the fighting. In fact, when we use mercenaries, or when we use, and we know that Eric Prince now is trying to set up, use his group, and I've forgotten what he calls them now. He's had like 4 or 5 different name changes since they started out as Blackwater. We know that he has met with the White House hoping to get that contract. What I am saying is that the Pentagon, from what I've read, does not want war with Iran. They know that that is going to be a very, very dangerous situation. However, they are gearing up for war with Iran.
Exactly.
Which is what they usually do when other options haven't failed. When I say other options, I'm talking about regime change and our interventions, our undercover interventions, which have been taking place in Iran. So it is very dangerous, especially when we're looking at the Straits of Hormuz. I think that's whatever takes place in that area will be the catalyst to start fires and start something that we will not be able to get out of. Now, however, saying that, I go back to what William Blum, God rest his soul, predicted before the election in late 2016. He predicted that if the neocons, just as you have pointed out, if the neocons take power, that they will be focused on Iran, if only because Iran is a stepping stone to Russia. And controlling Russia is our ultimate goal before we target China. We know that based upon U.S. foreign policy, which goes back to the era of Halford Mackinder in 1904 with his article, right? Some people think that's a conspiracy theory, but all you have to do is look at the evidence and how we've progressed since then. And we have to look at the fact that our major advisors consist of the Council on Foreign Relations, the RAND Corporation, all of these, the Heritage Foundation, all of these various think tanks, and they represent corporate interest. And many of the people that we're looking at today, whether it's Bolton, Pence, I don't think Pence and Pompeo, but we know that Kissinger, we know that Hillary Clinton, we know that Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think, I'm not sure about him now, but we know that a lot of them came through the Council on Foreign Relations. So that's why it is considered Wall Street's think tank and what is really crucial as to what U.S. foreign policy is. So I guess what I'm saying that, yes, those 4 Bs that were listed wanting war with Iran, but even more important than that is the others that we now call the deep state, which I really hate. It sounds so conspiratorial, but it does exist. And that's where most of the decision making will actually take place. So I've never taken it too seriously whether Trump wanted war or not, or any candidate, because once somebody becomes president, they are not an independent leader. They cannot go in, as I used to think CEOs did with companies, but I have worked for major corporations, and I know that even major corporations, you get a new CEO, and no matter what he plans to do, he's beholden to the board. He's beholden to the corporation. So
A very good point.
Yeah, so we have to keep all of that in perspective. But you're right. What I came in here for was Venezuela. And we've talked about Venezuela. You've focused on what is happening there. And it looks like the U.S. is losing that one, okay? Now, that does not mean that we're not going to continue. We're not going to go and send in mercenaries, and we aren't going to topple the democratically elected Maduro government, because we don't give up. I mean, we have these plans in place, and we never give up. We just look at things as setbacks. So we had a recent setback. But I just read this morning, and I can't quote my source, I'm sorry, but I just read this morning that Israel just sent troops into Honduras. Now, we know what it's like. We know that in 2009, Hillary Clinton as State Department Secretary and Obama, they provided a coup in Honduras. They constructed it, created it, and that's why we have so many immigrants coming across our southern border. Most of them, if they actually make it here alive, they end up incarcerated. But because the coup put in a government that was so corrupt and so criminal that the people simply were not able to survive there. And that's why they took the option of coming across land to come here in hopes of somehow surviving. But so that's very serious. We know that that the U.S. has Cuba, Nicaragua, and El Salvador in our gun sight. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure about El Salvador, what's happening. We've already caused enough problems there, and I think we have enough mercenaries there. Probably we train their military, but I do know that Nicaragua and Cuba are definitely in our gun sights. So Venezuela is extremely important, and I keep pointing out to people, yes, the oil, but it's not merely about the oil. It's also very geopolitical, and this is why maps are so important, to understand exactly what is taking place. And the fact that Maduro, as you pointed out, he will not be a U.S. puppet. And they are oil rich, and yes, we would like to have control of their oil, not necessarily because we want to utilize it, but we want to prevent it. We want to prevent it from going to places like Russia or China or wherever.
Exactly.
We want control. Now, in the meantime, we know that Guaido, I call him a pretender to the throne, I don't know any other way to refer to him, that the U.S. trained to take over in Venezuela. He never ran as a candidate. Oh, and yes, I saw another posting this morning. And again, I can't tell you my source, but evidently, well, I did. I actually read it. CNN.com actually claimed that Guaido, this pretender, had been voted in.
Yes.
I couldn't believe that. He never ran as a candidate. He never even received one vote. But at any rate, so that's CNN.com. So for anybody out there, if you're still getting your news from CNN, believe me, you're just getting lies and propaganda.
It's an important point,
it's very
Karen.
important.
Think of a parallel, for example. I mean, it's sort of like saying that the governor of Utah was elected. Governor of Utah is president of the United States because he was elected. When what you mean is he was elected governor of Utah.
Yeah.
I mean, the constitutional role, the job that Guaido held, he had come to through the mechanisms of the Venezuelan government, but he was never elected to anything at all. And for CNN to say in this unguarded way that he was elected president of Venezuela is absolutely astonishing. I mean, when your propaganda is that casual, it's pretty clear you don't care much about it.
Exactly, exactly. So let's see, I've lost my train of thought here. So okay, the embassy. There was a takeover by Guaido. Okay, the Venezuelan embassy, the people who were placed there by the Maduro government evidently have vacated here in the U.S. Well, then the U.S. has gone and sent in what they call Guaido supporters to occupy one, and I'm not sure where it is, Carl. somewhere, I think it's in the U.S., maybe it's in Canada. I've forgotten that. I wasn't paying attention. But in the meantime, the major Venezuelan embassy in D.C., when the Venezuelans left, they allowed supporters of Venezuela and Maduro to come in and occupy in order to prevent the D.C. police, the D.C. military, Secret Service, whoever, basically the CIA controlling it, from taking over and placing supporters of Guaido. Now, this, for our people in D.C., meaning Secret Service, meaning the police, to not protect a foreign embassy on our soil is a breaking of international law.
Sure.
Okay?
Right.
And the occupiers, we call them embassy protectors. Let me explain who they are. One, you have Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. Two, and some of her people. You have Kevin Zeese, who he's a member of the Green Party, but he's a member of an organization known as Popular Resistance. He and Margaret Flowers and many other people actually went to Venezuela and spent at least a week there doing research and examining everything that was taking place. They may have been there more than a week because flights were canceled during that period of time due to that blackout. And so they're now in the embassy. You have members of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and Answer coalition. They are one organization. And Brian Becker was there speaking. And you can see all those yellow signs with black writing. Those belong to the PSL and Answer. So they have members there occupying and then speaking out in front. And forgive me if I forget any other, we just various groups, and I think there's a group called Women for Peace or Women Against Violence, I've forgotten, who have also taken up residence there. Now, here's the problem. The date of the U.S. takeover, I believe, was supposed to be around the 24th of April, I'm not sure. Well, they passed it by. Nobody came in to take it over. But then very soon after, as of last week, I think maybe Thursday or Friday, suddenly you had all these people who are supposedly Venezuelan, American Venezuelans, claiming that they were born in Venezuela and that this is their embassy, coming and literally surrounding it. And I know that it was I think again it was Friday night. They were banging down the door of the back door of the embassy, banging it down, trying to break in, because this was being filmed. And then they surrounded it, and like Saturday and Sunday, preventing food from entering the embassy. And, you know, the people that are there, they're not getting any sleep. They were up all night, and they can't get food because these protesters or supporters of Guaido, as they call themselves, were surrounding the embassy and preventing anybody from getting any food into the people inside. Now, as if this isn't bad enough, as of yesterday, I think I saw how there are videos out there. Mainstream media is not covering this properly, if at all. It showed Medea Benjamin of Code Pink and Ariel and a couple other people outside sitting on the curb while the Guaido people were banging tin pots and pans, making excessive noise, chanting loudly with a bullhorn. And according to Lee Camp this morning, they were actually putting the bullhorn right up to their ears. And just the sight of Medea sitting there, I mean, she looks really awful, probably from lack of food, lack of sleep. Having people right there in her face, I mean, I found it really, really disturbing. And according to Lee Camp, these people are not nice, peace-loving people that want their Venezuelan embassy. I mean, what I saw was so disgusting, and the people were being so rude and arrogant and disrespectful. But he said that they were even sexually harassing the women by grabbing their breast and just doing all kinds of really nasty things. So today I circulated something from Andrea Merida, who's the co-chair of the Green Party U.S. And I've been circulating things that Carl, like to call our representatives to contact the State Department, but I can't find the email of the State Department. I think you said you were able to contact the Secret Service email, but I wasn't able to do that. And the reason is, when you see these people doing these horrible things, the police are standing there watching. The Secret Service are there. They're probably plain clothes. Some are in black, watching. And then they arrested members of the peace the peace occupiers, the embassy protectors, were being arrested. And the way Lee Camp explained it, here's what they do. The Guaido people are pushing like this and pushing people into the police. So then what do the police do? They go and arrest the person who maybe bumped them and say that, oh, well, you threatened me. So we've had 2 Code Pink people arrested. But then they did, I just read this morning that they did arrest 2 from the oppressive people. So here's what I wanted to point out that we can do, because what they really need is more people there. If anybody is near D.C., if anybody can get to D.C. and get to the Venezuelan embassy. Now, if you remain across the street, you will not be confronted with any violence. If you stay across the street where a lot of people are with signs and chanting. But it's only if you go and stand directly in front of the embassy that the violence that I'm describing is taking place. Now, what Andrea said, she said what you can do rather than sit back and do nothing is call your congressional representative. Go to www.house.gov/representation, and you will find your representative. And let them know, she said, because she knows that calling the Secret Service over the weekend did have an impact. It made a difference, because now the Secret Service has a canned script that they're letting in food and medicines. Whether this is happening or not, we don't know, and you can't believe anything anymore coming from anyone who represents our government. But that's their canned script when you call now, is that they are letting in food and medicines. And she actually has said right here, we have evidence to the contrary. So our activists in the embassy are now literally rationing food to get by. So by calling your congressional representative, we can turn up the heat and get some relief for our warriors inside the embassy. And so I'm urging everyone who sees this debacle taking place on our nation in D.C. to please take action. I mean, this, when you actually see it on video, if you can, you have to usually be on Facebook, because that's where most of the videos are coming in. It's really very disturbing, and it's quite clear that they want to push out the embassy protectors who are there legally. They are there at the invitation of the Venezuelan government, just as Russia is in Venezuela at the invitation of the Venezuelan government. So which is one of the reasons why I don't think the Pentagon wants to have war with Venezuela either, Carl. I mean, because they would be facing Russia. But that doesn't mean that we won't still take action and do things. And usually what we do is covert, and then just as we did in Syria. So see, you know, we had Gloria La Riva. Gloria La Riva is with the Party of Socialism and Liberation and Answer, and they brought her here a few weeks ago, and she spoke on conditions in Venezuela as she was there, and she spent a good deal of time interviewing people, talking to people, checking everything out, just as Max Blumenthal has done, just as many of these people have done, to get the true situation there. And even while she was speaking, there were local Venezuelans here that came and countered everything she said. While a couple were somewhat rude, nonetheless, some were actually very, very genuinely peaceful and concerned. nonetheless, there was one or two. One actually was offering a free trip to Venezuela. He said he would pay for a ticket for anyone who wanted to go and see true conditions. So after the talk, I was filming it for YouTube here, for UPTV, and so I called him on it. I'm still waiting for my ticket.
You haven't got your ticket yet?
No, no. I have to take out bullies. He was the bully. But what I'm seeing now in D.C. is so awful. The way these U.S. Venezuelans are provoking the peaceful protectors of the embassy. It's really disgusting.
On the other hand, you might argue, Karen, that the mess in Washington, the sort of unplanned unpleasantness, it seems, around the embassy and the protectors of the embassy who are inside, suggests that things are not going according to plan.
Right.
From the point of view of Washington, it's embarrassing to have something like this go on. It can't be really seen as this sort of harassment of supporters of the legitimate government of Venezuela in Washington can't be seen as a triumph on the part of the American policy to overthrow the elected government. And there's interesting parallels to that madness that is occurring elsewhere. There's a publication, a very good one, a blog site called Gray Zone.
Yes.
It was founded by Max Blumenthal, who has written very well on these and related questions for a while. Gray Zone is worth looking up when you can't count on any of these things turning up on Facebook, for example. And the Gray Zone published this week an account of a peculiar document from the U.S. State Department. What the State Department did was publish and then delete from the State Department website an account of the actions to be taken against Venezuela, such as the driving out of the legitimate government from the embassy. The Gray Zone got its hands on the State Department list that was posted and then canceled. And once again, it suggests the sort of disarray that's accompanying the American attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Gray Zone obtained a list of key outcomes, this is State Department language, on Venezuela that was deleted out of apparent embarrassment by the State Department. It boasts of wrecking the nation's economy, destabilizing its military, and puppeteering its political opposition. Now, since all of this has gone badly from the point of view of Washington, the State Department has actually axed this list. But the list was there and gives a very good idea of what the U.S. was doing, up to and including things like the harassment of the embassy. On April 24th, 6 days before the self-proclaimed Venezuelan interim president, Juan Guaido, attempted to violently overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected government, alongside a handful of military defectors, the U.S. State Department published a fact sheet that boasted of Washington's central role in the ongoing coup attempt. Everybody knew that was true, but for Washington to say it itself so clearly was odd. After realizing the incriminating nature of its error, the State Department quickly acted to remove the page. The Gray Zone, the blog we're talking about, had obtained a full copy of the expunged report. The deleted page puts to bed any claims of Guaido's independence from Washington, as the State Department emphasizes the fact that he, quote, announced his interim presidency in January at the top of a section dedicated to breaking down key outcomes of U.S. efforts in regard to Venezuela. I mean, said as clearly as they can that, yeah, he's our boy. U.S. Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Kimberly Breyer, recently took to Twitter to claim that, quote, since he became acting president, Juan Guaido has given tangible results to the people of Venezuela, close quote. Did they talk that way in the State Department? Her tweet was accompanied with an infographic detailing alleged accomplishments of the powerless coup administration based on data compiled by the legally defunct National Assembly, the only governing body actually controlled by Guaido. But the Venezuela fact sheet posted and then deleted days earlier by the State Department told a dramatically different story. By the way, we will post these documents, both the Gray Zone article and the State Department suppressed plan for overthrowing Venezuela, on the Facebook page for the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, AWARE. Entitled U.S. Actions on Venezuela, the State Department document, boasted that U.S. policy had effectively prevented the Venezuelan government from participating in the international market and has led to the freezing of its overseas assets. So when the government says, the elected government of Venezuela has destroyed the economy, it then goes to admit in its own account of State Department action that it was the State Department that destroyed the economy. It read like a sadistic celebration of Washington's retribution against the Venezuelan population as a whole, the kind of collective punishment which is illegal according to Article 33 of the Geneva Conventions. What Washington was saying was either you throw out your elected government and put in the people we like, same sort of thing we said, for example, in Ukraine, or we'll wreck your economy. And then they wrecked the economy. An act of war, surely, but also clearly contrary to international law. The State Department gloated in the deleted fact sheet that its policy had ensured that the Maduro government, the legitimate government of Venezuela, cannot, quote, cannot rely on the U.S. financial system to conduct business, noting key outcomes of U.S. actions include the fact that, quote, roughly $3.2 billion of Venezuela's overseas assets are frozen. The U.S. had accomplished that. It went on to boast that Venezuela's oil production fell to 730,000 barrels per day in March, substantially reducing government revenue. It had been much higher. If, quote, if I were the State Department, I wouldn't brag about causing a cut in oil production, which is a 36% drop in just the 2 months of February and March this year. Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, told the Gray Zone, quote, this means even more premature deaths than the tens of thousands that resulted from sanctions last year, close quote. Mark Weisbrot, a friend of this program, has been central to the CEPR's account of the economic activities, of the economic crimes of the United States against Venezuela. Weisbrot recently co-authored a bracing report, interesting way to put it, a bracing report which found that 40,000 Venezuelans died between 2017 and 2018 as a direct result of U.S. sanctions. Those with long memories can remember the sanctions on Iraq that were defended by Clinton's Secretary of State on the grounds that killing 500,000 children, which those sanctions were supposed to have done, was, quote, as she said, worth it, close quote. The State Department patted itself on the back for announcing its preparedness, quote, to provide an additional $20 million in initial humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. However, the CEPR report, Weisbrot's group, concluded that Trump administration sanctions implemented in August 2017 resulted in a loss of $6 billion in oil revenue over the ensuing year alone. While the State Department praised the opposition, that is the people we're trying to install in Venezuela, for providing medical and hygiene attention to over 6,000 Venezuelans, those numbers dwarf in comparison to 300,000 people CEPR estimated to be at risk because of lack of access to medicines or treatment, including 80,000 people with HIV who've not had antiretroviral treatment since 2017, 16,000 people who need dialysis, 16,000 people with cancer, and 4 million with diabetes and hypertension. Treatment for these people was cut off by the sanctions imposed by the U.S. government unilaterally and, of course, illegally. In other words, the supposed Venezuela crisis response assistance, touted by the State Department, what the State Department said it was doing, is not even a Band-Aid over the gaping wound that U.S. unilateral coercive measures have inflicted on the country. In Weisbrot's view, the policy and outcomes promoted by the State Department in the disappeared document will merely lead to, quote, more cuts in imports of medicine, food, medical equipment, and inputs necessary to maintain water, health, and sanitation infrastructure. Having denied the Venezuelan government the ability to provide for its own population, the U.S. has essentially promised that thousands more deaths will occur. The State Department did not respond to the Gray Zone's request for a comment on the fact sheet that the State Department had published and then immediately deleted. In a recent interview with the Gray Zone, Venezuela's ambassador to the United Nations, Samuel Moncada, characterized the deleted State Department fact sheet as, quote, a list of confessions, close quote. Imagine, he said, if any other country says it's proud of saying that we are destroying the economy of our neighbor, we are proud that we destroyed the political system of our neighbor, we are proud that they are suffering. They are saying we are waging war against Venezuela, Moncada emphasized. The ambassador, it's probably not an accident in a country that is largely Catholic that this language is used during the Easter period, but what it does point out is the suffering that the United States is inflicting on Venezuela, the United States government is inflicting on Venezuela for the purposes of the rich in the U.S. Imagine if any other country says, the ambassador went on to accuse the U.S. of engaging in bullying rather than international diplomacy. That seems obvious. The State Department's own fact sheet appears to support this accusation as it asserts, quote, diplomatic pressure resulted in fewer markets for Venezuelan gold, close quote. The document further highlighted the government of Venezuela tried to convert its gold reserves deposited elsewhere in the world to support for its population, and the U.S. managed to put a stop to that. The document further highlighted U.S. actions that had supposedly led more than 1,000 members of the military to recognize Juan Guaido as interim president and defect to Colombia, as well as standing an estimated 25 crude oil tankers with 12 million barrels, stranding 25 oil tankers. Let's try that again. What the State Department was saying was that it's done all sorts of good things, such as preventing the trade in Venezuelan oil. They say it's our key achievements, Moncada, the Venezuelan official, admitted that is the State Department's key achievement. They're saying that they're causing trouble in our military and inducing a military coup, which so far they haven't achieved, but that they're working towards. There's no question about what the U.S. is doing. They're saying so themselves in this document, which they then withdrew. If any other person says that themselves, the ambassador concluded, and you take that confession to court, they would be in prison. The State Department's fact sheet even frames recent decisions by the Organization of American States, the Lima Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the European Union to either recognize or support Guaido's shadow administration as a U.S. achievement, highlighting Washington's outsized influence with each of these supposedly international governing bodies. The statement is boasting that it has violated international agreements in order to get these international organizations to attack the economy of Venezuela. The decision to mention the EU, the European Union, and the Lima Group is particularly noteworthy considering the United States is not a member of either of those organizations, in spite of what you might think. Quote, they are so far out of any normal parameters of decency, morality, legality, reason, that really they are dangerous, Moncada said, Venezuelan official, said of the Trump administration. They are a real threat to international peace, and they are a real threat to my people, close quote. This account and the State Department boast which they have now withdrawn from their website, although it accurately describes what the State Department is doing. Both will be on our Facebook page for Aware on the Air. The situation is not over, but the ham-fistedness with which the U.S. has caused suffering and misery in Venezuela is hardly to be denied, and the notion that this is done to restore democracy or for the good of the people of Venezuela is obviously a very bad, indeed a vicious joke, and is recognized as such around the world, even in countries where their governments have kowtowed to American bullying. The situation is interesting, and one is reminded of Mao's remark that the situation is wretched and all is anything is possible.
Yeah, I should also mention that there is a form that one can fill in requesting, this is by Code Pink. You can either just go to Code Pink, codepink.org, their website, or our Facebook, Aware Facebook page, because if I haven't posted it there already, I will. Basically, this is a form. When I say fill in a form, it's just your email address, basically. That's all they want. Telling the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to drop the charges against activists for delivering food, because that's what these people were doing. And then they're being arrested. So, yeah, they just want your name and your email address, and then they Code Pink themselves will actually send it, the message to our representatives, as well as to Jesse Liu, who is the U.S. Attorney for District of Columbia. And so that's another action that can be taken in order to support the embassy protectors. Yeah, Carl, you know, it's really awful when we think about all that is being done in the world, and you know, even Yemen. We're still bombing Yemen. I mean, we're still starving the people out of Yemen
Right.
because even though they did get something through Congress, it was vetoed by President Trump, and the Senate evidently is not going to oppose his veto. So, yeah, I mean,
Well, the question was whether the Senate would override the veto.
Override the veto.
And
That's,
that
yeah.
didn't happen because
Right.
of the support of basically the pro-war majority in the Senate.
Exactly. So,
Both parties, by the
right.
way.
Well, same. Okay, you used the proper terminology. I just said oppose it, meaning, yeah, overrule the veto. Exactly, which they could have done. But, yeah, so it's a terrible situation right now. Really, it is. And for Venice, for all of these nations. Oh, one little thing I just want to point out to some people will refer to the Guaido supporters as white supremacists. Now, I want to make it very clear that this has nothing to do with white supremacy or racism, any more than colonization anywhere in the world, whether Africa, the Caribbean islands, was about racism. It's about economic control. But the fact of the matter is, those people, due to the colonization, that are members of the elite, tend to be Spanish descent. So they look more white, not all of them. The poor who are truly suffering in Venezuela, who have supported the Maduro government, tend to be people of color. And so for a lot of people, this is of major concern, is that, hey, we're doing it again. You know, some things never end. So again, it's not about white supremacism. That is not the cause. But you will see, and even Guaido, they said they picked him out because he was he's one of the elites, but, you know, he's got mixed blood, so he happens to be a little darker, and they thought that would be more appealing to some of the people. But yet, he has not appealed to the people. They are very, very bright. I mean, you really have to applaud the Venezuelan people. They have not been bought off. The military has stayed firm supporting Maduro. They are not allowing themselves to be bought off. The U.S. government, you know, we had, was it Bolton, I think, that was offering their military to desert and support Guaido. And the people, military had refused, and the people have refused. So it's a very serious situation. And for anyone who is concerned, keep in mind that the poor are really, really suffering as a result of our sanctions. I want to bring up insulin also on this. You mentioned insulin, and insulin is so expensive here in the U.S. that many people simply cannot have access to insulin. And they were getting it in Venezuela, they were getting it from Colombia until the recent sanctions. And then they started ordering it from India, which meant it took a lot longer. And now India is backing away because of the sanctions by the U.S. against them supporting Venezuela. So I really hope people take notice of what is happening.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on May 7th in the 19th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. government aids the Saudi government and their vicious war in Yemen, and the Israelis in their racist oppression of the Palestinian people. The Israeli government has murdered protesters at the fence with Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison camp. The U.S. supports that, primarily because Israel is a U.S. stationary aircraft carrier for the control of Middle East energy, gas, and oil, an American weapon against U.S. economic rivals from Venezuela to China. Such outrages cannot be dismissed as something that only happens elsewhere. In the Illinois legislature, our local representative, Carol Ammons, refused to vote against using University of Illinois funds to support Israeli apartheid, something Ammons would never have done for South African apartheid. On this show, we try to concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making around the world. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scholarly and Ethan Young. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly, by the way, by our own liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and the unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook and Karen Aram for the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.